Some stories stay with you longer than others. This one found me on a winter evening, and I haven't been able to shake it since. It's about a young woman named Clara, just 18 years old, and a choice that was never hers to make. Back in the 1880s, families sometimes paid their debts with things more precious than money. What happened to Clara in that Kansas farmhouse kitchen, and later in a small mountain church in Colorado, reminds me why dignity matters more than any contract ever written. I hope you'll stay with me through this telling. It's the kind of story that settles into your bones. The pen shook in her hand. Clara pressed the nib against the paper, and the ink bled sideways, soaking into the cheap grain like a wound that wouldn't close. Her father's shadow fell across the table. "Sign it." 2 words, no question in them. She could smell the coffee going cold on the stove, could hear her mother's breathing somewhere behind her, quick, shallow. The breath of a woman pretending not to be in the room. Clara's fingers cramped around the pen. The man with the ledger book watched her the way a buyer watches livestock at auction. Patient, certain. "Papa, can I read what it says first?" Her father's hand came down flat on the table. The coffee cups rattled. In the corner, her 12-year-old brother flinched. "You sign this or come morning. Your brother don't eat, none of us do. They take the house, the land, everything." His voice dropped. "You want that on your head." The W came out jagged. The ink tore through the paper at the curve of the H. By the time she finished her name, there was a black smudge on her fingertip that looked like something burned. Somewhere in Colorado, a man she had never met was waiting for his bride. If this story speaks to you, I'd be honored to know where you're listening from tonight. There's something special about knowing we're all gathered around the same tale, even from different corners of this country. Drop a word in the comments, your town, your state. Let's keep each other company. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Clara's teeth clicked together hard enough to taste copper. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of dust coating her tongue. Of strangers' elbows pressed against her ribs, of sleeping upright with her carpet bag clutched to her chest. She had eaten when the coach stopped at stations hard biscuits. Cold beans. Whatever they put in front of her, because her body demanded it even when her mind wanted nothing. Now the door swung open, and cold mountain air hit her face like a slap. Cedar Bluff. She climbed down. Her boots sank into mud that sucked at her soles, thick and red as old blood. The boardwalk stretched ahead, crowded with faces that turned toward her one by one. Women in bonnets, men in work-stained coats, all of them looking, all of them knowing. "Poor thing," someone muttered. Clara kept her eyes forward. A man stood apart from the others. He didn't wave, didn't smile. Just watched from beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, his shoulders set like a man bracing against wind that wasn't there. He walked toward her, stopped 3 feet away. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low, roughened at the edges. Sun had carved deep lines around his eyes. His hands hung loose at his sides, working hands, scarred across the knuckles. "I'm Daniel Hayes." She nodded. Couldn't find words. He reached for her carpet bag. Clara flinched backward before she could stop herself, her fingers tightening on the handle. Daniel's hand froze in the air. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the way a man might approach a spooked horse, he lowered his arm. When he reached again, his movements were deliberate, careful. He took the bag without brushing her fingers. "The boarding house is this way." He turned and walked. 3 feet ahead, always 3 feet ahead, Clara followed. Mrs. Harmon's place smelled of lye soap and bacon grease. The woman herself was small, gray-haired, with hands that never stopped moving. She showed Clara to a room barely bigger than a closet. A narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, a window that looked out onto nothing but mountain. "Supper's in an hour," Mrs. Harmon said. "You must be starving after that journey." Clara's stomach turned. "I ain't hungry, ma'am." The older woman studied her for a moment, then nodded and left. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged beneath her weight. Tomorrow. The wedding was tomorrow. Clara woke in darkness. No, she hadn't slept. She had lain on her back, staring at the ceiling she couldn't see, listening to the boarding house creak and settle around her like old bones. The kerosene lamp on the washstand had guttered out sometime in the night, and she hadn't moved to refill it. Now gray light seeped through the window. Dawn. Her wedding day. She sat up. The plate of bread Mrs. Harmon had left the night before sat on the small table by the door. Clara's stomach twisted, empty and sour. She crossed the room, broke off a corner of the bread, and forced herself to chew. It scraped down her throat like sawdust. She drank water from the pitcher until her stomach stopped cramping. It wasn't enough. But it was something. The borrowed dress hung from a nail on the back of the door, white cotton, yellowed at the hem. Someone else's dress, from someone else's cedar chest, carrying someone else's memories in its fibers. Clara stood and reached for it. The fabric was cold against her fingers. She dressed the way she imagined a condemned man might dress for the gallows. One arm through the sleeve, then the other. The shoulders hung too wide. The cuffs fell past her knuckles. She fumbled with the bone buttons at the back. Her fingers clumsy and thick. A small mirror hung above the washstand. Clara stepped in front of it. A stranger looked back. The face was pale, drawn tight across the cheekbones. Dark circles bruised the hollows beneath the eyes. 18 years old. And the woman in the glass could have been 30, could have been 100. Clara turned away. 3 miles outside of town, Daniel Hayes sat alone in his cabin. The fire had burned down to embers. Orange light pulsed across the floor, throwing shadows that stretched and shrank like breathing things. In his palm, a gold ring caught the glow. His mother's ring. He turned it between his fingers. The metal was warm from his skin, worn smooth from years of wear. She had given it to him the winter before she died, pressing it into his hand with fingers that trembled like dry leaves. Daniel. Her voice had been thin by then, barely more than breath. Don't ever marry a woman who won't look you in the eye when she says, "I do." You hear me? A woman who can't look at you ain't choosing you. She's just surrendering. He closed his fist around the ring. The girl who had stepped off that stagecoach yesterday, Clara Whitmore, she hadn't looked at anyone. Not the townsfolk who stared. Not Mrs. Harmon who welcomed her. Not him. She had flinched when he reached for her bag. Flinched like she expected to be struck. Daniel's eyes moved to the corner of the cabin, where a new rocking chair sat by the window. He had finished it 3 days ago. Sanding the pine smooth, weaving the rawhide seat tight. He had made it for her, for the wife he was supposed to bring home today. Now he wasn't sure what he was bringing home. A wife or a prisoner? He stood, The chair scraped against the wooden floor. He pulled on his coat, slipped the ring into his pocket, and walked out into the morning cold. He had something to say to Reverend Cartwright before the ceremony began. Mrs. Harmon knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer. "Time to go, child." Clara followed her down the narrow stairs, through the front parlor that smelled of dust and dried flowers, out onto the boardwalk. The mud had frozen overnight, and her boots crunched against the hard-packed earth. The church sat at the end of the main street, small, wooden, a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, like it was tired of standing straight. People were already filing through the doors, men in their Sunday coats, women in bonnets that hid their faces, all of them turning to watch as Clara approached. Her knees shook with each step. The borrowed dress dragged in the dirt. Mrs. Harmon's hand pressed against the small of her back, guiding her forward. And Clara wondered if the older woman could feel her trembling through the fabric. The church doors loomed ahead, dark wood, iron hinges, open like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Clara stopped. She couldn't do this. Couldn't walk through those doors. Couldn't stand at that altar and say words she didn't mean to a man she didn't know. Her lungs seized. Her vision narrowed to a single point of light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. "Miss," a small voice, high and thin. Clara looked down. A little girl stood beside her, 5 years old, maybe 6, brown hair escaping from beneath a too large bonnet, dirt on the hem of her dress. In her outstretched hand, she held a single wild flower, yellow petals, slightly wilted, picked from some roadside ditch. "For you," the girl said. "Mama says brides need flowers." Clara's throat closed. She reached out her fingers, shaking, and took the flower. The stem was warm from the child's grip. The petals brushed against her palm, soft as a whisper. "Thank you," Clara managed. The girl smiled, gap-toothed and bright, then ran back to her mother waiting by the church steps. Clara looked at the flower in her hand. Such a small thing. Ordinary. Worthless to anyone else. But it was the first thing anyone had given her freely in 2 weeks. The first thing that wasn't demanded, or transacted, or owed. She tucked the stem into the ribbon at her waist. Then she walked through the church doors. The pews were full. Every seat taken. Faces turned toward her as she entered, some curious, some pitying, some blank as stone. The pot-bellied stove in the corner sat cold and dark. The windows let in thin morning light that fell in pale rectangles across the wooden floor. And there, at the altar, stood Daniel Hayes. He watched her come. His expression was unreadable. His hands hung at his sides, and Clara noticed they were clenched into fists. Beside him, Reverend Cartwright held a worn Bible against his chest. The spine was cracked, the pages soft with age. He nodded at Clara as she approached, his face kind but distant, the way doctors looked at patients they couldn't save. Clara took her place across from Daniel. The space between them felt vast, a canyon, an ocean. She kept her eyes fixed on the collar of his shirt, unable to lift her gaze any higher. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Cartwright began. The words washed over her like water over stone. She heard them without understanding. Phrases about holy matrimony, about duty and devotion, about bonds that could not be broken. Clara's fingers found the wildflower at her waist. She pressed her thumb against the stem until it bent. Then Reverend Cartwright turned to Daniel. "Do you—" "Daniel James Hayes, take this woman." Clara finally lifted her eyes. Daniel was already looking at her, and in his gaze, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not possession, not satisfaction, something that looked almost like doubt. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned to face the Reverend. "I do." His voice was steady, clear, but Clara had seen something in that brief look, a flicker of hesitation. A shadow passing behind his eyes, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. What did it mean? What could it possibly mean? Reverend Cartwright nodded and continued reading from his worn Bible. The words blurred together. Holy matrimony, sacred vows, duties of a wife. Clara heard them the way she might hear rain on a distant roof, present, but unreachable, separated from her by some invisible wall. The whale oil candles on the altar flickered. Someone coughed in the back pew. A child whimpered and was quickly hushed. Clara's knees trembled beneath the borrowed dress. She had eaten that morning. A corner of bread, washed down with water. But it wasn't enough, not after 2 weeks of barely sleeping on that stagecoach. Not after the knot in her stomach that had been tightening since Kansas. Her body was running on something thinner than fumes. Her vision swam. The Reverend's face stretched and contracted. The candle flames elongated into streaks of gold. The edges of the room darkened, creeping inward like shadows at dusk. And Clara felt her body sway. Not now. Please, not now. She locked her knees, pressed her fingernails into her palms until the sharp bite of pain cleared her head for a moment. The congregation sat in neat rows behind her. She could feel their eyes on her back, hot and heavy as brands. Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, occupied the front pew in a dress of deep purple silk, a peacock among sparrows. Her gaze was the sharpest of all. Clara would not fall, would not give them the satisfaction. But her body had other ideas. The floor tilted. The altar swung sideways. Clara's hand shot out, grasping at empty air, and she stumbled half a step to the left before catching herself. Movement. Daniel broke formation without a word. He stepped past Reverend Cartwright, past the communion table with its lace cloth, and walked directly to the front pew. His boots were loud against the wooden floor 3 steps, 4, 5, and then the scrape of chair legs against wood as he lifted one of the simple pine seats and carried it back to the altar. Every head in the church turned. Daniel set the chair behind Clara. The legs scraped again as he positioned it, and the sound echoed through the silence like a gunshot. He didn't look at the congregation, didn't acknowledge their stares. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara's face as he leaned close. "Sit, if you need," he said. Quiet, just for her. Then he returned to his place across from her, hands clasped in front of him, as if nothing had happened. The silence stretched. Mrs. Pemberton's fan snapped open. The sound was sharp, deliberate. "Well, I never," she said, loud enough for the entire church to hear. Her husband, a thick-necked man with a gold watch chain stretched across his vest, shifted uncomfortably beside her. Clara didn't sit, but she felt the chair behind her knees solid, present, waiting, and something shifted in her chest, a loosening, a breath she hadn't known she was holding finally releasing. She looked at Daniel. He wasn't watching the Reverend. He was watching her, and in his face. She saw none of the triumph she had expected, no satisfaction at having displayed his generosity before the town, no smugness at having shown himself to be a gentleman. He looked concerned, genuinely concerned. About her. Clara's fingers found the wildflower still tucked at her waist. The petals were soft against her thumb, already beginning to wilt in the warmth of the crowded church. She pressed them gently, feeling their fragile structure give beneath her touch. Reverend Cartwright cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" The question was directed at both of them, but it was Daniel who answered. "Yes, Reverend." The older man nodded and returned to his Bible. More words, more phrases about honor and obedience and the duties owed between husband and wife. Clara listened, but her attention kept drifting back to Daniel, to the way he stood with his weight evenly balanced, like a man expecting a blow, to the white knuckles of his clasped hands, to the tension in his jaw that made a small muscle jump beneath the skin. He didn't look like a man claiming a prize. He looked like a man carrying a burden he hadn't asked for. The realization crept through her slowly, settling into her bones. Daniel Hayes hadn't purchased her with joy. He hadn't sent for a mail-order bride because he wanted one. Something else had driven him to this moment, some need or obligation she couldn't name, and now he stood across from her with that same doubt in his eyes that she felt twisting in her own chest. They were both trapped, both standing at this altar because circumstances had pushed them here, not because they had chosen it. The contract binding them had been signed by other hands, her father's, negotiating away his daughter to clear his debts. Daniel's, agreeing to terms that Clara had never seen and never would see. And here they stood, two strangers about to be yoked together for life, and neither of them had truly chosen the other. Clara's throat tightened. "Do you, Clara Elizabeth Whitmore?" Reverend Cartwright's voice cut through her thoughts. He had turned to face her now, Bible open in his weathered hands, eyes gentle but expectant. Behind him, the morning light fell through the small windows in pale rectangles, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the air. This was it. Her turn. Clara opened her mouth to speak. "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" The words hung in the air, every eye in the church fixed on her face. Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward, fan still, waiting. The child in the back pew had gone silent. Even the candle flames seemed to hold their breath. Clara looked at Daniel. He was watching her with that same expression, not possession, not satisfaction, but something that looked almost like understanding, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling, as if he had felt it himself. Standing in this same spot, speaking his own vows moments ago. She thought of the chair behind her, the way he had moved without being asked, the gentleness in his voice when he told her she could sit. She thought of her father's hand coming down on the kitchen table, the coffee cups rattling, the way no one had asked her anything at all. The word came out thin, barely audible. Clara swallowed and tried again. Her voice cracked. The congregation stirred. Someone whispered. Mrs. Pemberton's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. And then Daniel moved. Not toward the Reverend, not toward the congregation, toward her. His hand rose slowly, not reaching for her, not grabbing, just rising. Palm open, fingers spread. A gesture that could have been a plea or a warning or something else entirely. "Reverend," he said, "hold on." The church went still. Not quiet still. The difference was in the quality of the silence, the way it pressed against the walls and ceiling like something solid. Clara could hear the blood rushing in her own ears, could hear the creak of wooden pews as bodies shifted, could hear Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath from the front row. Reverend Cartwright lowered his Bible. "Mr. Hayes." Daniel didn't look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara, and in them she saw something she couldn't name. Something that made her stomach clench and her fingers tighten around the wilting flower at her waist. "This ain't right," Daniel said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of whispers spread through the congregation. Clara heard fragments, "What's he doing?" and "mighty strange" and "paid good money," but the voices seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the roaring in her own head. Daniel turned to face the pews. He stood with his shoulders squared, his work-roughened hands hanging loose at his sides. The morning light from the windows fell across his face, illuminating the deep lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He looked at the banker in the front row, at Mrs. Pemberton with her purple silk and her fan frozen mid-flutter, at the old blacksmith in the back, who had been fighting sleep moments before and now sat bolt upright, his rheumy eyes sharp with attention. "Most of you know me," Daniel said. His voice carried through the small church without effort. "You know I ain't a man who talks much. Ain't a man who makes scenes." The blacksmith muttered something under his breath. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she saw him nod. 14 years I've lived in this valley," Daniel continued. "Built my cabin with my own hands, raised my cattle, kept to myself." He paused. "When my mother passed, she left me her wedding ring, told me to give it to a woman who would look me in the eye when she said her vows, a woman who was choosing me, not just surrendering." Clara's breath caught. The word hung in the air between them, sharp and precise as a blade. Surrendering. That was exactly what she had been about to do. Stand here in this borrowed dress, speak words she didn't mean, and surrender herself to a life she hadn't chosen, just like her mother had surrendered to silence in that Kansas kitchen. Just like every woman in every pew behind her had surrendered to something circumstance, expectation, debt. Daniel reached into the pocket of his Sunday coat. When his hand emerged, he held the ring. Simple gold, worn smooth with one's age. It caught the candlelight and glowed like a small ember cupped in his calloused palm. "This contract," he said, "was made between her father and me. She never agreed to it. She never even read it." Mrs. Pemberton's husband shifted in his seat. "Now see here. Hayes, a contract's a contract. You paid $200. I ain't finished." The banker's mouth snapped shut. Daniel turned back to Clara. His boots scraped against the wooden floor as he closed the distance between them. 1 step. 2 steps, until he stood close enough that she could smell wood smoke and leather and something underneath that might have been fear. "I ain't gonna marry a woman who don't choose me herself." The words hit her like a physical blow. Clara's knees buckled, and she sat down hard in the chair he had placed behind her. The wooden seat was solid beneath her, anchoring her to the earth when everything else seemed to be spinning away. Daniel crouched in front of her. Not kneeling men like him didn't kneel, but lowering himself until their eyes were level. This close. She could see the flecks of gold in his brown irises, could see the fine tremor in his hands as he held out the ring. "You want to walk out that door right now," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "I'll pay your way home. The debt's settled either way. Ain't nobody gonna stop you." Clara stared at him. Behind her, the congregation buzzed like a hive of disturbed bees. She heard Mrs. Pemberton's scandalized whisper, "Reckon he paid good money for her. Mighty strange way to act, I'd say." Heard the banker protesting to no one in particular. Heard Reverend Cartwright clearing his throat over and over, as if trying to summon words that wouldn't come. But all of that faded to nothing as Daniel reached for her hand. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away. His fingers were warm and rough against her skin as he turned her palm upward. And Clara realized she was shaking, trembling like a leaf in a storm, but she didn't pull back. Daniel placed the ring in her open palm. The metal was warm from his body heat. It sat there, small and heavy and impossible. And Clara couldn't stop looking at it. Her mother's wedding ring had been plain silver, worn thin from years of hard work. This one was gold, solid. It would last a lifetime. "You decide." 2 words, that was all. But they contained more than any of the vows Reverend Cartwright had recited, more than any of the pretty phrases about love and honor and obedience. You decide. As if she had the right. As if her decision mattered. As if she were a person and not a piece of property to be traded between men. Clara's fingers curled around the ring. The edges pressed into her palm, hard and real. She looked up at Daniel's face, searching for the trick, the trap, the moment when he would laugh and snatch it back and tell her she was foolish to think she had any choice at all. But his expression didn't change. He simply waited, crouched before her in his Sunday coat that was slightly too small, his hands now empty. His eyes holding hers with a patience that seemed infinite. Behind them, the old blacksmith's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Well, ain't seen nothing like this in 40 years. Clara almost laughed. It bubbled up in her chest, unexpected and strange, and she had to press her lips together to keep it from escaping. 40 years. This old man had lived in this valley for 40 years, had watched dozens of weddings in this very church, and he had never seen anything like this. Neither had she. Neither had anyone. She looked down at the ring in her palm, at the door of the church, standing open behind the rows of staring faces, at the morning light streaming through, bright and cold and full of possibility. Then she looked back at Daniel. There was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read, something that went deeper than the doubt she had seen earlier. He wasn't just giving her a choice. He was fighting something inside himself, some fear, some memory, some old wound that had never fully healed. She didn't know what it was, couldn't name it, but she could see it there, flickering beneath the surface of his steady gaze. This man had paid $200 for her. He had every right, by law and by custom, to claim what he had purchased. No one in this church would have stopped him. No one would have blamed him. And yet here he was, crouched before her like a supplicant, offering her the one thing no one had ever offered her before: freedom. Clara's throat burned. Her eyes stung. She could feel the weight of all those stares pressing down on her. Could feel the expectation building in the air like a storm about to break. "Why?" The word came out hoarse, scraped, raw. "You paid $200. You could just take what you paid for." Daniel's jaw tightened. Something flickered across his face, old pain, old anger, directed not at her but at something she couldn't see. "My mother," he said slowly, "was a mail-order bride." Clara's breath stopped. "She came out west when she was 17. Daniel's voice was low, but it carried through the silent church. Clara could feel the congregation leaning forward, straining to hear. Could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on this small space between her and the man crouched before her. "Married a man she'd never met," Daniel continued. "My father, he wasn't a bad man. Not at the start, but he never asked her what she wanted. Not once, not in 30 years of marriage." His jaw tightened. The muscle beneath his skin jumped. She cooked his meals, washed his clothes, bore his children, and every single day she did what she was told, because that's what the contract said she was supposed to do. Clara's fingers tightened around the ring in her palm. The edges bit into her skin. "When she was dying," Daniel said, "she made me promise something. She said, 'Don't you ever be like him. Don't you ever take a woman who ain't choosing you. Because a marriage without choice ain't a marriage. It's just ownership.'" The word hung in the air. Clara saw Mrs. Pemberton's fan flutter, saw the banker shift uncomfortably in his seat, saw the old blacksmith nodding slowly, as if Daniel's words had confirmed something he had always suspected but never said aloud. Daniel looked at Clara. His eyes were steady, but she could see the cost of this confession in the lines around his mouth, the way his hands trembled slightly before he pressed them flat against his thighs. "I ain't gonna be that man," he said. "I ain't gonna be my father." Clara's throat closed. She thought of her own mother, the way she stood in the corner of the kitchen while Clara signed her name to that contract, the way her eyes had slid away, unable to meet her daughter's gaze, the way she hadn't said a single word not in protest, not in comfort, not in anything. Had her mother ever been asked what she wanted, Clara already knew the answer. "So here's where we are," Daniel said. He rose from his crouch, his knees cracking with the movement. He stood before her now, tall and weathered and impossibly patient. "You can walk out that door, right now. I'll pay for your passage back to Kansas. The debt your father owed, it's settled. I won't come after you. Won't send anyone after you. You'll be free." Free. The word tasted strange on Clara's tongue, even though she hadn't spoken it aloud. She had never been free. Not really. Not since she was old enough to understand that daughters were currency, that women were bargaining chips, that love and choice were luxuries reserved for people who didn't owe money. "Or," Daniel continued, "you can stay, but only if you choose to. Only if you look at me and say the words because you mean them. Not because someone else signed a paper saying you had to." He fell silent. The church waited. Clara could feel every eye on her, could feel the judgment and the curiosity and the barely concealed scandal radiating from the pews. Mrs. Pemberton had stopped even pretending to be dignified. She was staring openly now, her mouth slightly parted, her fan forgotten in her lap. But Clara didn't care about Mrs. Pemberton, didn't care about the banker or the blacksmith or the whispering women in their Sunday bonnets. She cared about the man standing in front of her, The man who had paid $200 for a bride and then offered her the one thing money couldn't buy: the right to refuse. Clara looked down at the ring in her palm. His mother's ring. Worn smooth by 30 years of work and silence and surrender. The gold gleamed in the candlelight, warm against her skin. "Well, this is highly irregular." Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through the silence like a saw through green wood. Clara's head snapped toward the woman. The banker's wife was on her feet, her purple silk rustling with every movement. The peacock feather in her bonnet bobbed as she shook her head. "Reverend Cartwright, surely you're not going to allow this spectacle to continue. The girl's father signed a contract. Mr. Hayes paid good money. The arrangement is perfectly legal." Reverend Cartwright opened his mouth, but Daniel spoke first. "Ain't nobody saying it ain't legal. Mrs. Pemberton." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Then what precisely are you saying?" "Mr. Hayes, I'm saying there's things that are legal that still ain't right." The words fell into the silence. Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath, her husband's uncomfortable shifting, the murmur of voices from the back pews, an old woman in the third row, the widow. Clara realized. The one who had been watching her with knowing eyes leaned toward the young girl beside her and whispered something. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she saw the woman's hand come to rest on the girl's arm, gentle and restraining. "Hush now, child," the widow said, loud enough to carry. "Some things take time. Ain't no rushing a woman's mind." Clara's chest ached. When was the last time anyone had defended her right to think, to take her time, to make a decision without someone else's hand on the back of her neck? Pushing her forward, she couldn't remember. The ring was still warm in her palm. She uncurled her fingers and looked at it, really looked at it for the first time. Simple gold, worn smooth by years of wear. There were tiny scratches on the surface, the kind that came from a lifetime of hard work. Daniel's mother had worn this ring while she cooked and cleaned and raised her children in a land she hadn't chosen. 30 years, Daniel had said. 30 years without anyone asking what she wanted. Clara thought of her own mother, the way she stood in the corner of the kitchen while Clara signed her name to that contract. The silence that filled the house after the mail order agent left. The way her mother had come to her room that night, had stood in the doorway without speaking, had finally turned and walked away without a single word of comfort or protest. Had her mother been asked what she wanted? Had anyone ever given her a choice? The church was quiet now. Even Mrs. Pemberton had subsided, her feathered bonnet still trembling with suppressed outrage, but her voice temporarily silenced. The banker sat with his arms crossed over his chest, his gold watch chain catching the light. The blacksmith in the back had settled into his seat with the air of a man watching a play he hadn't expected to find interesting. Reverend Cartwright cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give Miss Whitmore a moment to collect herself. This has been an unusual ceremony. She's had her moment." Mrs. Pemberton's voice was sharp. "The girl needs to make up her mind. We can't stand here all day." "Yes, you can." Daniel's voice was calm, flat, utterly without heat. But something in it made Mrs. Pemberton's mouth snap shut. He still hadn't moved, still stood there with his hands at his sides, his eyes on Clara's face, waiting. "Let her think," he said. "Take all the time you need." Clara's fingers tightened around the ring, all the time she needed, as if her thoughts mattered, as if her decision was worth waiting for. She looked at the door again, at the light streaming through, at the mountains rising beyond the muddy street, Then she looked at Daniel. He didn't look like the men she had known in Kansas. Didn't look like her father, who filled every room with his voice and his demands. Didn't look like the mail-order agent who had come to their kitchen with his ledger books and his appraising eyes. Daniel Hayes looked like a man who had made a promise to himself a long time ago, and was keeping it now regardless of the cost. Something was happening inside her, something she couldn't name. Not hope, it was too soon for hope. Not trust, she didn't know him well enough to trust, but something. A crack in the wall she had built around herself. A sliver of light where before there had been only darkness. She drew a breath. The air tasted of dust and candle wax, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of the wildflower still tucked at her waist. "Reckon I got a question," she said. Her voice came out rusty, unused, but it carried. She saw Daniel's eyebrows rise slightly, the first real expression he had shown since giving her the ring. "Ask it." Clara looked down at the ring in her hand, at her own fingers, red and rough from years of kneading bread and scrubbing floors, at the black smudge on her fingertip that had never quite faded, the ink from her signature still staining her skin. She looked back up at Daniel. "What happens?" she said slowly. "If I say yes." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. The church seemed to hold its breath around them. Clara could hear the creak of wooden pews, the rustle of fabric, the distant stamp of a horse's hoof somewhere outside. The morning light had shifted since the ceremony began, falling now through the western windows at a sharper angle, casting long shadows across the floor. "If you say yes," Daniel said slowly, "you come home with me, to my cabin, 3 miles outside of town." Clara's fingers tightened around the ring. "You'd have your own room?" he continued. "Your own space. I ain't expecting—" He stopped. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "I ain't expecting anything you don't want to give. We'd be married in name. The rest, that's up to you. When you're ready. If you're ever ready." The words hung between them. Clara turned them over in her mind, examining them for hidden edges, for the trap she still expected to find. "And if I ain't never ready?" Daniel's expression didn't change. "Then you ain't never ready. I made my choice when I sent for you. What you do with yours is your own business." Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through the silence like a saw through green wood. "This is absurd!" She was on her feet again, her purple silk rustling with every movement. "Reverend Cartwright, I insist you put an end to this circus. The girl is clearly overwhelmed. She doesn't know what she wants." Clara's head snapped toward the woman. Something hot and sharp rose in her chest, something she hadn't felt in 2 weeks, hadn't felt since she was a child, and still believed that her voice mattered. It burned in her throat, behind her eyes, in the tips of her fingers where they gripped the ring. "I know exactly what I want." The words came out before she could stop them, louder than she intended. Every head in the church turned toward her. Mrs. Pemberton's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Oh, and what is that, dear?" The endearment dripped with condescension. Clara felt it land on her skin like something cold and wet, and suddenly she was aware of how she must look to these people. The borrowed dress hanging off her shoulders, the too long sleeves she had to keep pushing up, the dark circles under her eyes from 2 weeks of sleepless travel, the hollowed cheeks from barely eating. She looked like exactly what she was, a transaction, a piece of property that had been shipped across the country like a sack of grain. "I want—" Her voice cracked. The hot feeling in her chest curdled into something else, something heavy and cold that settled in her stomach like a stone. She could feel the banker with his gold watch chain, the blacksmith with his knowing eyes, the young women in their Sunday dresses, looking at her with expressions that might have been pity or might have been relief that they weren't the ones standing here. Clara tried to speak again. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Mrs. Pemberton smiled. It was a small smile, tight at the corners. The smile of a woman who had just won an argument she hadn't expected to lose. "Perhaps," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "The girl should sit back down and let the men finish their discussion. She's clearly not equipped to make this kind of decision." The words hit Clara like a slap. Not equipped. She heard her father's voice in Mrs. Pemberton's honeyed tones, heard the mail-order agent's appraising silence, heard every man who had ever looked at her and seen not a person but a problem to be solved, a commodity to be traded, a mouth to be fed until someone else could be persuaded to take over the burden. Her legs buckled. She didn't fall, not quite, but she stumbled backward, her hip catching the edge of the chair Daniel had placed behind her. The impact knocked it sideways. The chair toppled with a clatter that echoed through the silent church, and Clara went down with it, her knees hitting the wooden floor hard enough to send pain shooting up her thighs. Someone laughed. It was quickly stifled, a sharp intake of breath, a hand over a mouth, but Clara heard it. And in that sound, she heard everything. The town's judgment, their amusement, their utter certainty that she was exactly what Mrs. Pemberton had said, a girl not equipped to decide her own fate. She knelt on the floor of that church, her borrowed dress pooling around her, her palms pressed flat against the dusty wood. The ring had rolled from her grip when she fell. It lay 3 inches from her right hand, catching the light from the windows, winking at her like an eye. Her face burned. She could feel the heat spreading from her cheeks to her ears to her neck. Her eyes stung. Her throat closed around something that might have been a scream, or might have been a sob, or might have been nothing at all. Just the sound of a girl who had finally hit the bottom of something she hadn't known she was falling into. This was it. This was who she was. Not a person with choices, not a woman with dignity, just a clumsy, hungry, exhausted girl kneeling on a dirty church floor while respectable people watched and whispered and waited for someone else to clean up the mess. She should have stayed in Kansas. The thought rose up from somewhere deep and dark, and Clara couldn't push it away. She should have stayed. Should have found some other way to pay her father's debts. Should have done anything other than sign that contract and climb aboard that stagecoach and let herself be shipped across the country like livestock. At least in Kansas, no one had pretended she mattered. At least there, she knew exactly where she stood. A shadow fell across her. Clara looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Pemberton's triumphant face, expecting another cutting remark, another perfectly aimed humiliation. Instead, she saw Daniel. He had crossed the space between them without a sound. Now he stood over her, blocking the congregation's view, his back to the pews and his face turned down toward hers. In his hand, he held the ring. He didn't offer it to her. Instead, he lowered himself to one knee, his Sunday coat pulled tight across his shoulders. His boots creaked against the wooden floor. He came down to her level slowly, deliberately, until his eyes were level with hers. "You fall down," he said quietly. "You get back up. That's all there is to it." Clara stared at him. His face was close enough that she could see every line, every scar, every weathered crease carved by years of sun and wind. His eyes were steady. There was no pity in them, no judgment, just a calm, patient presence that seemed to say, "I see you. I'm still here. Take your time." Behind him. Mrs. Pemberton made a sound of disgust. "For heaven's sake, someone help the girl up. This is unseemly." Daniel didn't turn around. "You ready to stand?" he asked Clara. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a question, a real question, one that expected a real answer. Clara's hands were still pressed against the dusty floor. Her knees ached where they had hit the wood. Her face still burned with shame. But something else was happening too. Something she couldn't quite name. This man, this stranger, who had paid $200 for her, who had every right to drag her to her feet and finish the ceremony he had paid for, was kneeling beside her on a church floor, in front of everyone, in front of the banker and the blacksmith and Mrs. Pemberton in her purple silk. He was kneeling. For her, Clara drew a breath. The air tasted of dust and candle wax, and underneath it all, the faint green smell of sage drifting through the open door. She looked at the ring in Daniel's hand, at his calloused fingers curled gently around the gold band, at the scratches on its surface, the marks of his mother's lifetime. Then she looked at his face. "Yeah," she said. Her voice came out rough. Scraped, raw. "I'm ready." Daniel nodded. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to pull her up or steady her or do any of the things that would have taken the choice out of her hands. He just shifted backward, giving her space, and waited. Clara pushed herself up. Her legs shook, her knees screamed, but she rose, one hand braced against the overturned chair. Then both feet under her, then standing on her own 2 feet in front of everyone. Daniel rose with her for a moment. They stood face to face in the aisle of that small church. The congregation watched in silence. Even Mrs. Pemberton had gone quiet, her fan still in her lap, her eyes narrowed. Daniel held out the ring, not placing it in her palm this time, not pressing it into her hand, just offering it, open-palmed, the way you might offer water to a wild thing that had finally stopped running. "Still your choice," he said. Clara looked at the ring, at the open door behind the rows of watching faces, at the mountains visible through the frame of light, blue and distant and impossibly vast. Then she reached out and took the ring from his hand. The ring was warm in her hand. Clara stood in the aisle of that small church, her borrowed dress dusty from the fall, her knees still aching, her face still burning, but she was standing, on her own 2 feet, and the ring, Daniel's mother's ring, rested in her palm like something living. She looked at it for a long moment. The congregation waited. She could feel their eyes on her back, hot and heavy. Could hear the rustle of fabric as bodies shifted in the pews, could smell the dust and the candle wax and the faint sweetness of the wildflower still tucked at her waist. Its petals crushed now, its stem bent. Clara drew a breath. The air filled her lungs, the first full breath she had taken in what felt like weeks, and when she let it out, something went with it. Something tight and cold that had been wrapped around her chest since Kansas, since her father's hand came down on that kitchen table, since the ink from her signature stained her fingertip. She looked up at Daniel. He stood where he had risen after kneeling beside her, his hands at his sides, his face patient and still, waiting, always waiting, as if he had nothing better to do than stand in this church and let her take as long as she needed. 2 weeks, Clara said. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Not loud, she had never been loud, but steady. The words didn't shake. 2 weeks on that stagecoach. Same thought going round and round in my head, like a wheel that won't stop turning. She could feel the congregation listening, could feel Mrs. Pemberton's sharp attention, the banker's impatience, the old widow's quiet understanding, but she wasn't speaking to them. Not really. Kept thinking I ain't got a choice. Papa signed the paper. Money changed hands. It's done. Clara's fingers tightened around the ring. The edges pressed into her palm. Hard and real. I walked into this church believing I was a thing. A sack of flour. Something to be bought and sold and shipped wherever someone else decided. Her voice wavered on the last words. She paused, drew another breath, steadied herself. But things don't get asked questions. She looked at Daniel. His eyes were fixed on her face, steady and unblinking. Things don't get chairs pulled out for them when they're about to fall down. Something flickered in his expression, a loosening around his eyes. Ain't nobody ever let me think before, Clara said quietly. Not once? Not in my whole life. You did. The church had gone silent again. Even Mrs. Pemberton had stopped whispering. Even the banker had stopped shifting in his seat. Every eye was fixed on the two of them, the cowboy who had stopped his own wedding, and the mail-order bride who stood in a borrowed dress with a gold ring clutched in her trembling hand. Clara looked at the ring in her palm. Then she did something she hadn't planned. Something that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise everyone else in that church. She held the ring out to Daniel. He looked at it, looked at her. His brow furrowed slightly, a question forming in his eyes. Clara extended her other hand, palm down, fingers slightly spread, not reaching for him, not asking him to give her anything, offering. For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. His eyes traveled from the ring in her right hand to the left hand she held out to him, and Clara could see him working through it, understanding what she was saying, what she was doing, what it meant. Then his face changed. It wasn't a smile, exactly. The lines around his eyes didn't soften that much, but something in his expression shifted, like clouds parting to let through a single ray of light. He reached out and took the ring from her right hand. His fingers were warm and rough against hers, a working man's hands, scarred and calloused from years of labor. He held the ring carefully, as if it were something precious, something earned. Then he took her left hand in his. His thumb brushed across her knuckle just once, just barely, and Clara felt the touch all the way down to her toes. He turned her hand gently, positioning her fingers, and slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It was slightly too big. It would need to be sized. But it sat there on her hand, warm from his touch. And Clara looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Whole. Reverend Cartwright cleared his throat. Clara had almost forgotten he was there. The old man stood at the altar, his worn Bible clutched to his chest, his eyes moving between Clara and Daniel with an expression that might have been confusion or might have been wonder. Then, he said slowly, Do you Clara Elizabeth Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband. Clara looked at Daniel, at the ring on her finger, at the open door behind her, still offering escape, still framing that rectangle of morning light and mountain air. She took a breath. I do, she said, because I choose to. The words filled the church like bells ringing, like something heavy finally being set down, like the first warm day after a long, hard winter. From the back pew, the old blacksmith's voice rang out, rough and delighted. Now that's something. That's really something. And then, impossibly, unexpectedly, someone began to clap. It was the widow in the third row. Her weathered hands came together once, twice, 3 times. The sound sharp and clear in the wooden church. The young girl beside her joined in. Then the woman behind them. Then a man near the door. The applause spread through the congregation like ripples on still water. Not everyone joined. Mrs. Pemberton sat with her arms crossed, her face tight with disapproval, but enough did. Enough that the small church filled with sound, filled with something that felt almost like celebration. Daniel looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them spoke. But when Reverend Cartwright cleared his throat again and said the words that made them man and wife, something passed between them. An understanding. A beginning. You may kiss the bride, the Reverend said. Daniel didn't move. He looked at Clara. A question in his eyes. The same question he had been asking all morning. In every gesture and every word. What do you want? Clara felt the weight of the congregation's stares, felt the expectation pressing down on her like a physical thing. A kiss was expected. A kiss was tradition. A kiss was what happened at the end of every wedding ceremony since the beginning of time. But Daniel wasn't moving. Daniel was waiting. Daniel was giving her yet another choice. Clara thought about it. Thought about the man standing in front of her, this stranger, who had paid $200 for a bride and then spent the entire morning proving that she was worth more than any contract. This man who had knelt beside her on a dirty church floor, who had offered her freedom when he had every right to claim ownership. She didn't know him. Not really. Not yet. But she wanted to. Clara rose up on her toes. Her knees protested they would be bruised tomorrow. She knew, but she ignored the pain. She placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder to steady herself, felt the solid muscle beneath his Sunday coat, felt him go very still beneath her touch. Then she pressed her lips to his cheek. It was brief, barely more than a brush of skin against skin. But it was her choice, her gesture, her way of saying, I see you too. When she pulled back, Daniel's eyes had changed. The doubt was still there, buried deep. But there was something else now, too. Something that looked almost like hope. Well, Reverend Cartwright said, his voice warm with something that might have been approval. I believe that concludes the ceremony. The church erupted again. More applause, a few cheers from the back. The blacksmith stomping his feet against the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like music. Daniel offered Clara his arm. She took it, and together, they turned and walked toward the open doors, toward the light, toward the mountains, toward whatever came next. Clara's knees ached with every step. The borrowed dress dragged in the dust. The ring on her finger was slightly too loose, and she had to curl her hand to keep it from slipping off. But she was walking out of that church on her own 2 feet, beside a man she had chosen, into a life she would build for herself. And that, she thought, was worth every bruise. The church doors swung open. and light poured in. Clara blinked against the brightness. After the dim interior, the candle smoke, the dusty air, the press of bodies and eyes, the Colorado afternoon hit her like cold water. She raised a hand to shade her face, and the ring on her finger caught the sun. Gold flashed, warm metal against her skin. Behind her, the church bell began to ring. The sound rolled out across the valley, deep and resonant, announcing to everyone within earshot that a marriage had taken place. Clara listened to it echo off the mountains, and something in her chest loosened another fraction. The bell wasn't ringing for a transaction. It was ringing for a choice. Her choice. Daniel walked beside her down the wooden steps. His boots were loud against the boards, solid, steady, unhurried. He didn't take her arm, didn't guide her with a hand on her back, just walked, matching his pace to hers, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Her knees protested with every step. The bruises from her fall were already forming. She could feel them, deep aches that would turn purple by morning. But she kept walking. The townspeople had gathered outside. Some had followed them from the pews. Others had drifted over from the boardwalk when they heard the bell. Clara saw Mrs. Harmon standing near the general store, her gray hair escaping from its bun. Her face creased with something that might have been relief. The older woman raised a hand and waved. Clara waved back. It was such a small thing, a hand lifted, a gesture returned, but it felt enormous. It felt like the first real communication she had managed since stepping off that stagecoach, not a transaction, not an obligation, just one person acknowledging another. That was the longest 3 minutes of my life. Daniel's voice was low, rough at the edges. Clara turned to look at him. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw set, but the corner of his mouth twitched. She almost smiled. 3 minutes, she said. Felt longer. Felt like 3 years. They walked in silence for a moment. The mud had thawed under the afternoon sun, and their boots squelched with each step. Clara's borrowed dress dragged in the dirt, the hem growing heavier and darker. She didn't care. The dress wasn't hers anyway. Nothing she wore was hers, except the ring. She looked down at it as they walked. The gold band sat slightly loose on her finger, warm from her own body heat now. Someone would need to size it. Someone would need to make it fit. But for now, it stayed where Daniel had placed it. And Clara found herself turning it with her thumb, feeling the smooth metal slide against her skin. The main street of Cedar Bluff stretched ahead of them. Shops with wooden facades and tin awnings, a livery stable with horses shifting in their stalls, a saloon that wouldn't open until evening, its doors shut tight against the afternoon light. Everything looked different than it had yesterday. Smaller, somehow, less threatening. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. They passed the boarding house where Clara had spent the night. The small window of her room faced the street, and she could see the curtain, Mrs. Harmon's yellowed lace, pulled back to let in the sun. The remains of the bread would still be on the table inside. What little she had eaten that morning. Her stomach cramped with hunger. "You ain't eaten," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Clara glanced at him. Surprised. He was still looking ahead, his face unreadable, but something in his voice told her he had noticed, had been noticing. "Not much," she admitted. "There's food at the cabin. Ain't fancy, but it's something." Clara nodded. Her mouth watered at the thought actual food. After days of barely keeping anything down, but she pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for eating. There would be time for everything. They turned off the main street onto a narrower path. The buildings fell away behind them. The mountains rose ahead, blue and vast, their peaks still capped with snow even in late spring. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, tinged with pine and sage. 3 miles. Daniel had said, 3 miles to his cabin. Their cabin now, she supposed. Though the thought still felt strange. Foreign. Like wearing someone else's clothes. They walked in silence for a long while. Clara watched the landscape change around them. Meadows thick with new grass, stands of aspen trees, their leaves trembling in the breeze, a creek that ran alongside the path, its water clear and cold and quick. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang a bright, liquid sound that seemed to belong to this place in a way Clara herself did not. Not yet. Anyway, the blacksmith had nodded at Daniel as they passed through town. A few others had done the same small gestures, barely perceptible, but Clara had noticed. Not everyone in Cedar Bluff disapproved of what had happened in that church. Some of them, maybe, even respected it. There, Daniel pointed. Clara followed his finger and saw a cabin nestled against the base of a low hill. Small, solid, built of logs that had weathered to a soft gray. Smoke rose from the stone chimney. He must have banked the fire before leaving for the church, and a covered porch ran the length of the front. Shaded by an overhang of cedar shingles, it looked like a home. Clara's throat tightened. They approached slowly. Daniel's boots crunched on the gravel path that led to the porch steps. Clara's followed. 2 sets of footsteps, moving together. Not quite in sync. At the door, Daniel stopped. He didn't reach for the handle, didn't push it open, just stood there, his hand hovering near the worn wood, and turned to look at Clara. "Go on," he said. "It's your home now, if you want it." Clara looked at the door, at the worn handle, smooth from years of use, at the small window beside it, curtained with plain muslin, letting in soft light. She thought of all the doors she had walked through in her life. Her father's house, where she had never felt welcome. The boarding house in town, where she had been a temporary guest. The church, where she had entered as a piece of property and emerged as something else entirely. This door was different. This door, she could choose. Clara reached out and pushed it open. The cabin was small, just as Daniel had said. 1 main room with a pot-bellied stove in the corner. A table and 2 chairs. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The floor was rough-hewn planks, swept clean. The walls were bare except for a single shelf holding a few books, a kerosene lamp, and a photograph in a simple wooden frame. A cast-iron pot hook hung by the fireplace. A tin coffee pot sat on the cold stove. But there, beside the window, stood a rocking chair. It was new. Clara could tell from the color of the wood-pale pine, not yet darkened by age and the tightness of the rawhide seat. It didn't match anything else in the cabin. It looked like something that had been added recently, deliberately. "That's for you," Daniel said from behind her. "If you want it." Clara crossed the room. Her fingers found the arm of the chair, tracing the smooth curve of the wood. Someone had sanded it carefully. Someone had taken time with this. She sat down. The chair creaked beneath her weight, settling into a gentle rhythm. Rock forward, rock back. The motion was soothing, ancient, familiar. Her grandmother had owned a chair like this, back when Clara was small, before the debts, before everything. Her knees throbbed as she settled, the bruises making themselves known. But the pain felt distant now, manageable. Daniel hadn't followed her inside. He stood in the doorway, framed by the afternoon light, waiting. Clara looked at him. At this man who had paid $200 for her and then given her the right to refuse him. At this stranger who had knelt beside her on a church floor and told her to get back up. "I don't know you," she said. His face didn't change. "I don't know you neither." A beat of silence. Then Daniel stepped into the cabin. He crossed to the stove, opened the iron door, and began building up the fire. His movements were efficient, practiced kindling first, then larger pieces of wood, then a match struck against the rough metal of the stove's side. The flames caught, light flickered across the walls. "But I'd like to," he said without turning around. "If you'd let me." Clara watched the fire grow, watched the shadows dance across the floor, watched this man, her husband now, at least in name, tend to the small, necessary work of making a home warm. Outside. The meadowlark sang again. Inside. The fire crackled and popped, and Clara sat in her rocking chair, turning the ring on her finger, feeling its weight settle against her skin. Not a brand anymore. A beginning. "Reckon we got time," she said quietly. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. For a moment, their eyes met. Then he turned back to the fire, and Clara turned back to the window, and the silence between them stretched out, not empty, not awkward, just present. Two strangers in a small cabin at the foot of the mountains, a fire burning in the stove, a rocking chair creaking softly against the wooden floor. And outside, the last light of the afternoon spilling gold across the valley, warm and patient and full of possibility. Clara's carpetbag sat by the door where Daniel must have brought it earlier. Still packed, still waiting. She would unpack it when she was ready. There is something quiet that stays with us after a story like this one. Something that settles in the chest and doesn't ask to be named. Perhaps it feels familiar, the weight of choices made for us, or the ache of words we never got to say. Many of us have stood in rooms where our voice didn't seem to matter. Some of us have loved people who never learned how to ask what we wanted. We have carried things quietly, for years, without anyone noticing the weight. And perhaps, listening to Clara's story tonight, something stirred that we thought we had put away long ago. That is all right. It does not need to be understood or resolved. Some feelings are meant to be held gently, not fixed. The fire in Daniel's cabin will keep burning. Clara's carpetbag will wait by the door until she is ready. And we, too, can let this story rest where it is unfinished in the way that real lives are unfinished. Tender in the way that real choices are tender. Thank you for staying until the end. It has been a gift to share this evening with you.